On va parler d'un sujet important.
We're going to talk about something which is important, biodiversity, obviously. It's a real subject. It's one about which we talk a great deal in the media. It's in order to say what? Well, using the media, we say that it's a thing, a good thing. Or is this something that's actually, being destroyed? Lots of international bodies working on the subject, on this topic. And if you look at the USN, their last studies from the 50,000 species that have been studied, then 20% of them are threatened, they're in dangers. And 80% of flying insects have disappeared. 40% of field birds are disappearing. Pollinators, the list goes on. And normally it was 60 million years ago. The dinosaurs were extinct. That's really the last time we saw a species wiped out. But this is where we're going. In spite of that, then, we are working in the MAP field, which is very rich in biodiversity. We've got roughly 120 species. In fact, we're probably more to around 300, 400. There's a plethora of richness, botanical richness, which in turn generates economic richness with markets which represent the biodiversity. 70% of the anti-cancer drugs are plant-based. So you can see the importance of biodiversity in maps. So today, with a great many participants, we're going to look at the subject. We're going to analyze the importance of biodiversity, how it can be a real source of wealth for the MAP sector. And I'm going to invite our first speaker to come to the rostrum, 𝗕𝗶é𝗺𝗺𝗀𝗺 from 𝗕𝗶é𝗺𝗺𝗺. And by way of an introduction and to set the framework for the discussion, she's going to talk about biodiversity from the perspective of an agricultural farm. What does it mean? What does it represent? And this will allow us to set a framework for the debate before hearing the different opinions from each of the speakers on the screen. Hello, everybody. Biosphere, well, we're a company who supports producers, farmers, technicians as they move towards regenerative agriculture or agroecology. And the goal of my presentation today is to talk about how you can characterize biodiversity on a farm and how are we going to be able, through different measurements, how can we quantify it? How can we form matrices in order to really measure it at agricultural level? So I know you've already heard what Philippe said, but why are we talking about biodiversity at agricultural level? Well, the intensification of different agricultural practices in terms of working the soil, mechanics, fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers. We've seen the change in the agricultural landscape. We can see a reduction of habitats and available resources for biodiversity, and this, in turn, has brought about a reduction in diversity and a reduction of abundance of living organisms in our soil. A little definition, which is fairly general, was saying it's all of the living creatures, whether this be flora or fauna, but all of the areas, including all the areas where these organisms evolve and interact. So it's the interaction between living organisms and their environment. I think there are three levels. You have genetic diversity, as we said this morning. For a species, for example, wheat, you're going to have several varieties of wheat with different genetics. You're going to have specific diversity and ecosystemic diversity. And if you look at this from an agricultural perspective, if you look at a typical farm, you're also going to find other kinds of diversity. You can have cultivated, crop-related diversity, different varieties, different races, perhaps of animals. Functional biodiversity. What's that? Well, it's everything that's going to make the services to agriculture easier. So we're going to have the pollinating insects, pollinators. You're going to have the pests, their auxiliaries, and everything that helps decompose, any denuders. So you can have direct biodiversity, which has an impact on agriculture, but there's also a real interest in maintaining the balance in the ecosystem, which is essential. Well, it's essential for maintaining life and organisms in the soil. I'm now going to talk about functional biodiversity because through regenerative agriculture, this is what we're going to try and encourage. So what services are offered by this diversity? Well, we've got the pollinators. You've got all of these insect pollinated flowers, and they depend on insects in order to reproduce. You're going to have the denuders, which are microorganisms, earthworms, for example. And you're also going to have everything that's linked to microorganisms, fungus, bacteria, which are going to help degrade material and render it easier for the plants. It's going to maintain the health of the soil and make sure all of the various elements are available. Then you have natural enemies, that's insects, birds, or chiropters. You're going to have, like, for example, bats. And what we want to do with them is maintain the trophic chains, which is the food chain. Make sure it's respected and maintained so that we respect their presence and respect their way of I suppose, regulating. So how are we going to characterize biodiversity on a farm? What are the components necessary on the farm? First of all, we're going to have to look at what's happening around the farm so you can take stock of the area and look at the potential in terms of biodiversity of any given parcel of land. You're going to look at the landscape, the countryside. You can see what you see if there's any kind of ecological continuity between the parcel and the sources. There could be the woods, copses, ponds, and any natural environment. And the idea that there is a continuity, an ecological community, which allows the organisms to move around in their source area and move to their target area. In terms of diversity of systems, then we have to look around the parcel. Are we talking about monocrops, or we're looking at diversified? Have we got trees? Have we got cover crops? Have we got arable crops? Have we got 100% just arable? So we have to look really at what's happening in terms of diversity of the crop. Then we have the artificial zones, so to speak. What has man been doing? Because obviously this has an impact on nature. Are we near an airport or a major motorway? If there's something 2 kilometers away, is this going to have an impact? Perhaps this is stopping different organisms in their tracks, preventing them from moving. And this is, once we've done that, we're going to go further. We're going to see what's happening in terms of the farm. We're going to look at farm practice on the parcel, on the farm. We're going to see if the agroecological infrastructure is in place. And there we're talking about hedges, grass strips, isolated trees, ponds. And we're going to look at technical management. How do they do it? What's their fertilization practice? How do they work the soil? And obviously we're going to look at pest and illness control. To go further then into the practices which encourage biodiversity, we're going to begin with the following. We're going to begin with the AE, that's agroecological infrastructure. What does it mean? What does it include? And how can we manage this infrastructure on a farm? We're going to look at, as I said, hedges. Well, the objective of the hedge is to really constitute, to build a corridor which allows organisms to move. We're going to look for as diversified a hedge as we can possibly find, with as many different layers, strata. We could have something that's got, I don't know, something that's got climbing plants, for example, like ivy, something with trees. The idea, of course, is that the hedge becomes a refuge for the maximum number of organisms possible, representing the largest amount of diversity. Then we're going to look at these grass strips. It's very easy to put them in place. You're going to put them in areas where you're not producing any crops. Particularly when you're looking at perennial crops, this can be a wonderful source for everything that's live organisms. And much like as you would for the hedges, you're going to try and have as much family diversity as possible. Family of species, I'd like to add, or different plant families. Be really different, be as creative and diverse as possible, not have the same morphology in the flowers. So it's not going to attract simply the same kind of organism. Have as much diversity in terms of morphology as possible, and obviously having a blooming period which takes place over the longest possible time, and to ensure the resources for these organisms. We're going to have areas which are not cut. In the same way as you have the strips, the hedges are going to be refuges, with some organisms are going to be able to seek refuge and breed. You're going to then have other areas. Make sure we don't cut around these areas during the reproductive period. So to do this possibly, if possible, in winter, in order to maximize or minimize the effects on biodiversity. What about ponds then? 40% of species, of animal and plant species, which depend on wet zones in order to survive. Therefore, the importance of ponds cannot be underestimated. You make sure it's not very far from your farm. It's extremely beneficial for biodiversity. And we're going to have everything linked to, when I talk about refuges, this could be nesting places. It could be a group of, like a pile of branches or stones set in old wars. It can be walls, it can be dead wood, etc. Wherever some organisms would be happy enough to reproduce. In terms of practices then, initially then, we have to look at annual plants. And what's really important is to change up the rotation, make sure it's diversified. So whether this be for annual or perennial plants, make sure there's an alternance between cornflower and mauve plants. You're going to have a food source here with that, which is slightly more reduced if you don't indulge in crop rotation. We have to improve that and encourage biodiversity using the proper system. We're going to be able then to do what? Bring something else to the table between the cornflower and the mauve. You're going to be able to bring summer cover, a winter cover. So this is a food source. It's an extra food source for the organisms that are hiding there within. And you work on the crop association. Here you've got cornflower, which is next door to a shamrock, and that's going to allow us to increase biodiversity. It's called associated biodiversity, and this allows us to reduce any phyto treatments. That's what we can do with annual plants or perennials. But with perennials, we're going to play on the inter-row section. And there you can have rose. It's a rose plant, rose crop. And the carabid beetles are not going to be able to pass and go into the field for its reproduction. It's not going to be very favorable for the carabids. So what we're going to do initially then, as you can see from the picture, You're going to make sure that there's sodding, continuous sodding, so there's constantly grass there, making sure that we manage the size and of the interrow, so we can carry out the interventions necessary on the parcel. But there's still growing roses here, and this is going to encourage the pass off all the different organisms, and it's going to be a shelter for all the organisms that are seeking just that. And if you want to go even further, and this is possible, you have these grass strips, which, much like the ones I showed you earlier, these flowery strips, which are going to harbor all of the flying and climbing insects and give as much shelter as possible to the organisms in need. Another practice which might encourage diversity, well, you can work on the reduction of the amount of soil work, because you have earthworms which feel the impact of the soil being worked, and some beetles carry part of their cycle in the soil. So if you work in the soil, you're obviously going to disturb them or kill them. So we're going to try and limit that as much as possible. And then we've tried to limit the use of pesticides, obviously. Pesticides are not very selective, are they? And they're going to have an impact certainly on the pests, but also on the ancillary creatures. So you have to try and reduce that. And we have to try and play on fertilization, encouraging organic fertilization rather than mineral fertilization, because organic fertilization is going to feed the denuders, like the microorganisms and the earthworms, and it's also it's going to contribute in no small measure to encouraging biodiversity. So how can we look at biodiversity on a farm? How can we quantify it? That was my initial question. In an indirect fashion, how can you measure biodiversity? Well, I'm going to pick up on what I said earlier. With the these infrastructure, agro-ecological infrastructure, you're going to look at diversity. You're going to, have I got hedges? Have I got flowering hedges? Have I got flowering strips? Have I got grass strips? We're going to look at density. That's the surface covered by these IAEs, given the entire surface of the farm. And we're going to look at connectivity. Do I have a good connection between all of the different infrastructure so that the organisms can move freely? We're also going to look at different practices. We're going to try and assess soil work. We are working with the 𝗕𝗺é𝗺, which is a measure for assessing the level of disruption in the soil. We want to have that as low as possible, quite clearly. You look at the depth and the speed at which you work and the kind of tool that's used to do just this. We're going to look at cover. We're going to look at the surface in terms of the period, how long that cover is going to last, the crop cover. And we're going to EIQ and the EFT, and this is what's used out with France. The EIQ, I believe, but it's very similar to the IFT. And the idea is to have an IFT or an EIQ which is as low as possible. I want to look at cultural diversity, having as many different species as possible on the farm. The more I have, the better I am, obviously, in terms of biodiversity and potential welcome of other insects. And also fertilization. Are we mineral? Are we 100% mineral? Are we mineral plus organic? Are we 100% organic? Etc., etc. So that's everything that's going to be measured indirectly. There's an INRA study that came out in 2025 by 𝗕𝗶𝗺, which really worked on putting together many articles and identified the link between these practices and biodiversity. Because these are indirect measures. You can have direct measures. We have them. We do them in biosphere, but it costs more and it takes up more time. But it's information at a given time. But you can do it, of course, and you can do it using different trapping methods. I've put a few examples in front of you. You've got the unwellness tent, and that's going to go anything to do with flying fauna. You've got the barber point for climbing insects, like the beetles. Then the Japanese umbrella, We use this in when you knock down a tree and you cut into the trunk, you see whatever's going to fly out into the umbrella. And we also work with sensors, obviously, video sensors, audio sensors are going to manage to capture the noise, the songs of birds, etc. And we were able to identify which species it is. And this allows us to have a real measure of diversity and the abundance of ancillary creatures around. It gives us any extra information, which is slightly more specific than what we're getting immediately on the parcel. And it also allows us to see if things are balanced. On the graph, you can see for an agricultural context, it's fairly diversified. We've got a great many species. So the question is my system working properly, or are there really all these resources present? So my concluding slide, how can you measure diversity with indicators? Well, I showed you there are practical ones when you measure the IEUs and the technical management and also trapping. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup.